Morning and welcome to session 31, I think we're on today, of Exploring LDS History, where we're doing our best every week to take an honest look at the history of the LDS Church, but to do so in a way that's respectful and loving. I'm doing my best to try to follow the counsel of Colossians chapter 4. I want to be gracious in my speech, and I hope I come across, find that balance between being caring and compassionate, but also just being honest when we look at history and what actually happened and what we can learn from that. And so, if you're still with us after 31 weeks, thanks for joining us on this journey. We're picking up this week in the 1840s, and I've really struggled with how to present. So many things happened so fast in those few years that the saints were in Nauvoo. I've struggled with how to best present it. It's hard to just go linearly through every year because there are just so many things going on. And so the Nauvoo period, I'm taking more of a topical approach to look at different things that occurred while the church was in Nauvoo. So not long after Smith arrived in Nauvoo in late 1839, and if you haven't been here in past weeks, it's helpful to remember the saints had been run out of Missouri literally at the point of a gun and told that you have got to leave. And so they left and fled for Illinois, where they were warmly greeted initially in Illinois. So not long after Smith got there, he set off for Washington, D.C., armed with affidavits and petitions he was seeking restitution for all the harms that had been done to them in Missouri, particularly for all the lands that they had lost and the lives that had been lost in Missouri. He went to Washington, D.C., trying to make all of that right. Along the way, as he was traveling to D.C., he wrote this letter back to his wife, Emma, that you kind of see his concern at the time. He said, "It'll be a long and lonesome time during my absence from you, and nothing but a sense of humanity could have urged me on so great a sacrifice. But shall I see so many perish and not seek redress? No. I will try this once in the name of the Lord. Therefore, be patient until I come and do the best you can." So hang in there while I'm gone, he says, but I have to at least try to right the wrongs that were done to us in Missouri. So he got to Washington, D.C., and he could not have gotten there at a worse time in terms of actually anything being done for his problems, because when he got to D.C., he ran right smack into the biggest issue in American government at the time, and that is the issue of states' rights. And we're still 20 years from the Civil War at this point, but that whole issue is just a powder keg, right? And the union's hanging together, and that issue of one of states' rights is one that no politician wanted to touch because everything was just being held together by a thread in the first place. And so when Smith did get an audience with President Van Buren, who I go, how do you get to be the president and have hair like that? That's crazy. He finally got an audience with President Van Buren, and Van Buren told him bluntly, I can't do anything for you, because if I do anything, I'm going to have the whole state of Missouri down on my head over it, right? And they're wrestling, is this a federal issue? Is this a state issue? And he said, I can't do anything. And Missouri, of all the states, was one of the most volatile up to and during the Civil War. And he said, I can't risk bringing all the state of Missouri down on me. Smith did have a couple friends who were in the senators from Illinois. And you might remember from last week, they were warmly welcomed at first in Illinois. And a huge voting bloc in Illinois. So both the Whigs and the Democrats were courting the Mormon vote. And so the two Illinois senators, they tried to get a hearing for his petitions on the floor of Congress, and they were voted down. And eventually, Smith's evidence, he was asking for $2 million in restitution, was given over to a Senate Judiciary Committee to investigate. So he gave them all of his evidence, but as soon as the Missouri congressmen and senators heard about it, right, they went and gathered all of their evidence and everything that the Mormons had done and everything that came out in Joseph Smith's trial in Missouri. They gave it all to the Judiciary Committee. And so after getting both sides, they all said, yeah, we ain't touching this. We're not doing anything. And he was eventually informed that, you know, if you got an issue, you need to take it up in court. This is a Missouri issue. This is a state issue. This is not something the federal government should be involved in. So after a lot of time and effort, he wasn't able to get any help. He did get another audience with Van Buren before he left, and Van Buren told him, sir, your cause is just. I feel bad for you. I feel bad for what happened, but there's just nothing I can do for you. So Smith, and some of this, and we'll get to this in a couple weeks, some of Smith's frustration in this time period, and the fact that, right, we talked last week how much he is growing in popularity and acclaim during this same time period. And his frustration, all of this kind of comes together and ends up with Joseph Smith running for president in just a couple years. And so we will get to that in a few weeks. Meanwhile, back in Nauvoo, the city continued to grow rapidly. Just exploded in growth. So within 2 years, they had 2 steam sawmills, a flour mill, a tool factory, and a foundry. And farmers and converts who were pouring into the area who didn't have money to purchase land themselves. There was a communal farm that they all worked on outside of town. And so Nauvoo just continues to grow incredibly rapidly in those first couple years. You can see in this picture the Nauvoo temple that wasn't completed until after Smith's lifetime, but they were working on it as fast as they could to get it done. And all Mormon men were expected to spend, they were given a tithe of their time to work on the temple. So 1 day in 10, they were expected to spend working on the new Nauvoo temple. So work was going on that. So everything's just growing super fast. And during that same time period, in 1841, Smith received a revelation ordering the saints to build a hotel. And this is interesting because there are very few, by the time we get to Nauvoo, there's only a handful of revelations included in Doctrine and Covenants from this whole time period, the last few years of Smith's life. And I think that's because by that point, the church had grown so much and his power had grown so much that they had reached a point anytime he wanted something to happen, he didn't have to say, thus saith the Lord anymore. Right? He had enough power in the church at that point that all he had to do was say, I said do it, and he could get it done. So he didn't have to resort to revelation as often. And so that's why I find this one interesting. Doctrine and Covenants 124 commands them to build a hotel, and also in that hotel to grant a suite of rooms for Smith and his family on the top floor of the hotel. And that building that was built is still standing today. It's called the Nauvoo House, or the Mansion House. And I'll just read part of Doctrine and Covenants 124, where God says, let my servant George and my servant Lyman and my servant John Snyder and others build a house unto my name, such a one as my servant Joseph shall show unto them, upon the place which he shall show unto them also. And it shall be a house for boarding, a house that strangers may come from afar to lodge therein. Therefore let it be a good house. Build it well, worthy of all exception, that the weary traveler may find health and safety while he shall contemplate the word of the Lord and the cornerstone I have appointed for Zion. And so notice again the language. Where's Zion now? It's Illinois. Right? And we talked about that last week. Had been Missouri, but it's become a fluid thing. So now Zion is Illinois. And this is largely what they used it for. Smith received a lot of visitors during that time. They would put them up there, and especially important dignitary kind of visitors. They had a place to put them up and where he could entertain guests. But God did specifically also say, make sure you got room for Smith and his family and for future generations. So now I say unto you, as pertaining to my boarding house, which I have commanded you to build for me, let it be built unto my name, and let my name be upon it, and let my servant Joseph and his house have place therein from generation to generation. So have a space for him and all of his family, not just him, but future generations of his family. And Doctrine and Covenants 124, it's interesting to me for this reason, that Joseph had reached a point where, like a lot of modern day false prophets, where they blend that line between the goodness of God and prosperity, or worshiping God and commerce, right? It's all blended together. And kind of this, that you'll see a lot of health and wealth teachers today, right? If you just give, God will bless your socks off. If you give to my ministry, usually is what they say, God will bless your socks off as a result of you doing it. And you kind of see that blending. Doctrine and Covenants 124 specifically, it's very long, but if you go and read it, it goes into all of this detail about how to build a hotel and how to run a hotel and how to sell stock to fund it. And God specifically says, tell this guy and this guy and this guy to buy stock in this hotel, right? God commands specific individuals to invest in building this. But then blended in that, in the same revelation, you have new theological teaching about baptism for the dead and temple practices and things like that, all coming together in this one kind of lengthy revelation. So it's kind of interesting. You kind of see those aspects coming together. So anyway, the Nauvoo house was built. Meanwhile, Smith had sent 9 of the 12 apostles he sent to England from 1839 to 1841 on a mission there, and they had phenomenal, unbelievable success in England. And I think there's a couple practical reasons for that. They get to England, and the apostles saw poverty far worse than any poverty they had ever seen in America. And a lot of the saints knew what it was to be poverty-stricken, right? They've been throwing up cabins and moving from one place to another for years now. But this was, the Industrial Revolution had hit in Europe, and living conditions in London at the time were horrible. Because you have thousands working in factories that are living in tenements with sometimes literally thousands of people crammed into tenements with no running water, very, very poor living conditions, very poor wages. And so they saw horrible, horrible poverty. And when they started preaching the Mormon gospel in England, they taught the gospel of America as much as they taught the gospel of Joseph Smith. And they began to talk in their communications with people in England about how they talked as much about how great America is as about how much great Jesus is. And a lot of Brigham Young sermons in England focused on immigration and there's a better place. And they began to also publish a paper called the Millennial Star that sang the praises of America on a regular basis. And that sounded, right? That's always been a lot of people still today in impoverished parts of the world, right? You have the great hope of America and the American dream, and it could be better for me if I can just get there. And so that's the message that they're getting out a lot. And I was thinking this week too, I don't know if you've noticed, it's a lot in this class of quoting this paper and this paper and this paper and this paper, right? Said this. But we have kind of forgotten in our day and age how powerful the press was in this time period, because that was the only way to get information out to a wide audience and a mass audience. And it's going to be that issue that ultimately, just to set the table for a few weeks from now, it's that issue that leads to Smith's death more than anything else, was his interfering with the freedom of the press. And so we'll get there. But the Millennial Star, they started publishing, and it ran stories like this one from 1842, where they ran an article that said, living in America is about 1/8 of the cost of what it cost in this country. And millions of acres of land lie before them unoccupied, with a soil as rich as Eden, and a surface as smooth, clear, and ready for the plow as the park scenery of England. That's a bit of a stretch, maybe, but, right? Farmland just laying there for you. Instead of a lonely swamp or a dense forest filled with savages, wild beasts, and serpents, large cities and villages are springing up in their midst with schools, colleges, and temples. There being an abundant room for more than 100 million inhabitants. And they're not wrong, right? And immigrants are pouring into America from all over the world, as they still are today during this time. So they start selling the American dream, and that sounds really good to these people. And I think that has a huge influence on the numbers of people who convert from England. Well, where all that becomes important to our story today is they were so successful in England that these converts began pouring in to Nauvoo from England. In 1840, there were 200. In 1841, it jumped to 1,200. In 1842, there were 1,600 immigrants from England that immigrated to Nauvoo. And that number kept going up. Parley Pratt said, they would rather be slaves in America than starve in this country. I can't hold them back. Right? There's so many converting and that want to come to America, I can't stop them. So by 1844, there were 8,000 people in the queue waiting to come to Nauvoo. And one of the things the apostles did really well, and a lot of this is owed to Brigham Young, who we start to see, again, we saw glimpses when they left the far west and came to Illinois. He held things together. And he was just a great organizer and leader of men. And he's primarily responsible for this, that they put together an effective immigration system where they chartered their own ships, they organized all of the supplies, they organized the schedule, and they managed to get people from England to America for about 4 pounds a person, which that's not much, right? That's really cheap. Can you scrape together 4 pounds? Right? We can get you to America for that. And their system was so efficient and so good that they were actually cited by the House of Commons in England, given a commendation and shown as a business model for others to follow, that they were so good at it. And again, a lot of that was Brigham Young's doing. So all that's to say, you have these masses of converts coming in from all over Europe, but particularly England during this time. They're contributing to the growth of Nauvoo as well. Also, about that same time, this is the first time we meet this man, John Bennett, who would, for a very brief period of about 2 years, have a huge influence on the church. Bennett he was a doctor of midwifery. He was a baby doctor. He was also the secretary for the Illinois Medical Society. He was quartermaster general of the Illinois State Militia. So he had some clout in Illinois. And he had written Smith a series of letters before moving to Nauvoo where he talked about how awesome he was. And Smith bought it and was very quickly taken into his confidence. And again, not to play psychologist, but I do think it's interesting we see that Smith was very easily taken in or took to people who he viewed as being important or respectable people. If you remember back, we saw that with Sidney Rigdon when they first moved to Ohio, right? Rigdon was educated, he was smart, and Smith just gobbled it up. And the same thing happened with Bennett. And I think, I'm not so certain that Bennett isn't a case of a con man conning a con man. That I don't know that his heart was ever, I don't know if he was ever really a believer. But for 2 years, man, he had an important role. And it wouldn't end well with Bennett, and we'll get to that either next week or the week after. His specialty, again, was midwifery. He ends up all kinds of, he just never was quite who he claimed to be, but he shaped Smith's thinking on this same time, spiritual wifery was his thing, right? he had a huge influence on Smith in developing the doctrine of polygamy. And once that had been practiced, there was rumors all over Nauvoo that he was kind of the guy you could go to if in one of your spiritual wifery situations you ended up pregnant and wanted to end the pregnancy, right? He could perform abortions. And so lots of stuff that was going to come out later. But initially it was all stars and roses. And he gained Smith's confidence quickly. He assured Smith, I can lobby for you at the state legislature to get the Nauvoo charter pushed through. I can get that approved. And the Nauvoo charter, which we mentioned last week, it's an amazing document. I saw one historian said there's never been a charter like it in the history of the United States that granted one city so much power, right, and so much independence, that it just gave them a lot of leeway to set their own laws, to have their own military, and set them apart. And again, everybody was courting the Mormon vote because it was a huge chunk of the vote in Illinois. So Bennett went to the state legislature. He cozied up to both parties, and he succeeded in getting the Nauvoo charter passed with a voice vote without anybody having actually read the charter itself. Right? And that's a decision that the legislature is going to regret in a few years. But they passed it based on Bennett's word. He wrote back to Smith saying, every power we asked for has been granted, every request gratified, every desire fulfilled. And at this point in our story, even the great Abraham Lincoln, who was an Illinois state senator at the time, he becomes a part of the story. And even he told Bennett afterwards that he had the magnanimity, that is a hard word to say out loud, magnanimity to vote for our act, and came forward and after the final vote to the bar of the House and cordially congratulated me on its passage. So he got the Nauvoo charter pushed through, which gave Smith and the saints a lot of power. But here's the mind-blowing thing. Less than a year after coming to Nauvoo, Bennett had become the assistant president of the church. The second in command. Now, Sidney Rigdon's still there. He's still part of the first presidency. But after they came back from prison in Missouri, he was never the same. And he still held the title in the first presidency, but Bennett took over all of his responsibilities for all practical purposes. And he becomes Smith's right-hand man. He's his closest confidant for a very brief period. Smith made him the mayor of Nauvoo, the chancellor of the University of Nauvoo, and second in command only to Smith in the Nauvoo Legion. And so, boom, he's just there. And, right, Smith gives him all of this authority in the church for this very brief window of time. He had a lot of influence on Smith. And so he will be coming up again in our story a little bit later. But I really think, again, I don't know that Bennett was who he claimed to be. I'm not sure he wasn't taking advantage of Smith the whole time. That's my feeling on that, but it's not going to end well with him. He also used his position in the militia to get 3 cannons and 250 guns for the Nauvoo Legion, which was a lot of arms for a state militia group. To have any cannons for a state militia unit was a big deal. And they had 3, and Smith paraded and drilled the Legion constantly. And like we talked about last week, they started using military titles rather than church titles in Nauvoo. And Smith loved being called Lieutenant General instead of President during this time period. To further protect himself, there was the constant threat of people trying to serve warrants from Missouri to take him back and to stand charge for his charges there. So the same time period, Smith appointed his own personal bodyguard made up of some of the toughest, meanest guys in the church. And most of these guys were all people who had been part of the Danites back in Missouri. and they wore their own special uniforms, and they were his own Secret Service detail. But some tough characters. Porter Rockwell would go on to be infamous in Western history as a gunman and a murderer. And the only question is, did he kill under orders from Smith or Brigham Young, or were they oblivious to everything he was doing? But he would be infamous in Western lore. Just one story really quickly about Porter Rockwell that I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago. After they had moved to Illinois, and Governor Boggs of Missouri was no longer in office as governor, an assassination attempt was made on him. While he was sitting in his study one night reading by candlelight, somebody shot him in the head through a window. And word got back to Nauvoo that Boggs was dead, and the saints celebrated. God's justice had been done. But he ended up, he recovered from his wounds and had a full recovery. And Porter Rockwell was arrested. And I think there's convincing evidence that he probably did it on orders from Joseph Smith. Porter Rockwell was arrested for that. He spent a long time in jail in Independence, was eventually let go due to lack of evidence, and he was released. And he made his way back to Nauvoo, where Smith was entertaining guests one night when this drunken, hairy beast of a man came in the room, and Smith didn't recognize him, and he told the sheriff who was there to toss him out. And as they were tossing him out, he recognized, it's Porter. And so, once he realized who it was, he hugged him, he welcomed him, he embraced him, and he told him, "You are going to be like a modern-day Samson. And as long as you never cut your hair, the Gentiles will never be able to touch you." And so from that day forward, a razor never touched Porter Rockwell's head. And he died of natural causes in the late 1870s, I believe, in Missouri. And this isn't a class about Porter Rockwell, but if you study it, you go, he was Joseph Smith's, an enforcer for Smith and later for Brigham Young, and not the kind of guy you mess with, but blind, bulldog, loyal. Like couldn't read, couldn't write, but loyal to Smith and then loyal to Brigham Young. And whatever they said, he would do, and he wouldn't question it. Rockwell was actually, I believe he was the 8th or maybe the 9th convert to the church. Way back in 1830, one of the very first people baptized when they first started the church as a 17-year-old in New York. And he just stayed blind, bulldog loyal to Smith till the end of Smith's life. So he's a fascinating character. But this is one of the guys he has around him now. Wild Bill Hickman might be another name that you are familiar with, who is famously referred to nowadays as Brigham Young's avenging angel, who, again, depending on who you believe, carried out a lot of murders at Brigham Young's behest after the saints got to Missouri. So these are tough guys. Hosea Stout, after Smith died, would be the sheriff of, or chief of police in Nauvoo under Brigham Young. It's actually really interesting. When Joseph Smith dies, the church was thrown into chaos when he died in terms of succession and who the next leader is. And so there's a lot of vying for power there. And about a month after Smith died, Smith's brother Samuel died quickly of a disease he was sick and then he was dead. And his widow and William Smith, who was the only Smith brother left at that point, they both believed that Samuel had been poisoned to death by Hosea Stout under orders from Brigham Young. So I don't know for certain whether that's what happened or not, but these are the kind of guys that were part of his bodyguard. John D. Lee, you might be familiar with. He would become famous in Utah history for his role in the Mountain Meadow Massacre. And Lee said about his role as one of Smith's bodyguards, "It was my duty to do as I was ordered and to not ask questions." And he wrote an autobiography later that we get a lot of information about from this time period. So Smith has his own personal bodyguard now. He's parading the Legion all the time. And Bennett took a very hard-line, very public stance on the intention of the Legion. And to me, he published this series of articles in the Times and Seasons that made it clear that we are going to avenge all the wrongs done to the church. And to me, it reminds me a lot of, Rigdon played the role in Missouri of being the rhetoric man, right? He got him in trouble with his speech on July 4th for his strong words and harsh comments. And now Bennett's kind of taken that role. So just one example, he said as part of that series of articles in Times and Seasons in 1842, he said, "The blood of murdered Mormons cries aloud for help, and the restoration of the inheritances of the saints." And so we're still talking about everything that happened in Missouri. "And God has heard the cry. And if the moral battle must be fought and the victory won, he who answers by fire will cause sword and flame to do their office. And again make the Constitution and laws paramount to every other consideration. And I swear by the Lord God of Israel that the sword will not depart from my thigh, nor the buckler from my arm, until the thrust is consummated and the hydra-headed fiery dragon slain." So it's that kind of tough language that started to make their neighbors in Illinois nervous. That and the fact that they're constantly parading the Nauvoo Legion in full uniform. They're constantly drilling, right? And the numbers are huge, far larger than any other militia in the state. So they're building this massive army, and at the same time, they're publishing statements like that starts making their neighbors a little bit nervous about all of this. So we read an editorial by James Bennett, a different Bennett, who said some very flattering things about Smith in the New York Herald. And he published in 1842 a letter from a United States soldier, a full-time soldier in the Army, an officer, had been visiting Nauvoo and was there one day when the Legion had been drilling and doing their parade. And it's interesting, his take on that. So this is Bennett speaking at the beginning. He says, "By the mails last evening we received a variety of letters and papers from Nauvoo, the capital of the new religious revolutionary empire, established by Joe Smith, and also from other towns in Illinois, exhibiting the extraordinary progress of this most extraordinary people who call themselves the Latter-day Saints." And again, Smith ate up any kind of editorial or piece like this. "In Illinois, they have already shown how to acquire power and influence by holding the balance of power between both the great parties." They've got this huge voting bloc. "They can already dictate the state of Illinois. And if they pursue the same policy in other states, will they not soon dictate to Congress and decide the presidency? If they keep growing the way they are. In all matters of public concern, they act as one man, with one soul, one mind, and one purpose." And this is the account the soldier had sent to him of what he had seen in Nauvoo. "Yesterday was a great day among the Mormons. Their legion, to the number of 2,000 men, was paraded by Generals Smith, Bennett, and others, and certainly made a very noble and imposing appearance. The evolutions of the troops, directed by the Major General Bennett, would do honor to any body of armed militia in any of the states and approximates very closely to our regular forces." So this is an officer in the Army saying, these guys are trained as good as we are. What does all of this mean? Why this exact discipline of the Mormon Corps? Do they, sorry. That and Colonel always gets me. Do they intend to conquer Missouri, Illinois, Mexico? Is it true they are part of the militia? It is true they are part of the militia of the state of Illinois by the charter of their legion, but then there are no troops in the states like them, in point of enthusiasm and warlike aspects, yea, warlike character. Before many years, this legion will be 20 and perhaps 50,000 strong and still augmenting. A fearful host filled with religious enthusiasm and led on by ambitious and talented officers, what may not be effected by them, perhaps the subversion of the Constitution of the United States. And if this should be considered too great a task, foreign conquest will most certainly follow. Mexico will fall into their hands, even if Texas should take it first. Now, sir, what do you think of Joseph, the modern-day Muhammad? I arrived here in Cog on the 1st, and from the great preparation for the military parade, was induced to stay to see the turnout, which I confess has astonished and filled me with fears for future consequences. The Mormons, it is true, are now peaceable, but the lion is asleep. Take care and don't rouse him. The city of Nauvoo contains about 10,000 souls and is rapidly increasing. It is well laid out, and the municipal affairs appear to be well conducted. The adjoining country is a beautiful prairie. Who will say that the Mormon prophet is not among the great spirits of the age? So, you can see how that might make people living in the town just south a little bit nervous during this time period. So Smith's fame is increasing. People are writing things. There's plenty of people writing negative things about him, but people writing positive things, and he ate it up. And as his fame and notoriety grew, so did his preoccupation with making his history known. And for the first time, he began thinking about, somebody ought to write down everything that's happened. And he began working on his official history of the church. And but by this time, more than 20 years have passed since his first vision. And so, writing many, many years after the fact, Smith wrote his history the way a celebrated prophet in 1840 would have lived, not the way things actually had transpired. And if you want to go back and listen to the first few classes, we spent a great deal of time talking about the fact that his official version of the first vision totally contradicts what he had been saying for years and years happened. And that's the case with a lot of his history of the church. And some of that's probably, we tend to look back on our lives with rose-colored lenses, right? You look back on high school and go, oh, wasn't it great? When the reality is, it stunk, right? Right? You remember all the awesome stuff, but who would want to go back and be a teenager again? I don't want to deal with that. But when we look back, we look fondly at all of the good things, and we tend to, that's why we talk about the good old days, because we tend to filter out a lot. And there's certainly a lot of that happens in Smith's history, where he doesn't write things as they actually occurred. He writes as he's viewing them from where he is in the early 1840s. In this same time period, the Book of Mormon was a constant headache for Smith, because they'd been around long enough and they're getting enough notoriety, and there's a lot of things starting to be published now that were very critical of the Book of Mormon, in pointing out, grammatical errors and historical inconsistencies and all of those things that we talked about back when we were talking about his translation of the Book of Mormon, right? There's stuff starting to be published that does not portray the Book of Mormon in a good light. And so that was constantly a headache for him, and they'd published newer versions where they tried to correct all the grammar and spelling mistakes, 3,300 and some changes to date that have been made from the first published version of the Book of Mormon. So he's dealing with those hassles. All of his witnesses are gone now except for his brothers Hiram and Samuel. Everybody else has either died or they've left the church. And so his witnesses are gone. So it was a constant headache. When Cowdery left, he took one of the only two original manuscripts of the Book of Mormon with him, leaving only one remaining manuscript. And Smith had it buried in the foundation of the Nauvoo house when it was being built. And according to Ebenezer Robinson, who was there, he said they're having this ceremony laying the foundation of the house, and he had to run back and get the manuscript. He brought it with him, and as he's flipping through the manuscript to make sure it's all there before he puts it in the foundations of the house, he said, I've had enough trouble with this thing. and we're just going to bury this and get it out of sight. We have recovered that today. It was water damaged in the intervening years, but the majority of that manuscript does still exist today. But Joseph, despite all that, he never apologized for the Book of Mormon. He called it famously the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion. But he did get frustrated with the constant criticism of it. One thing that apparently irked him a great deal was there was this argument going around, and it's not a good argument at all, but critics were saying Mormon comes from a Greek word meaning monster. And apparently that was getting bantied around so much that Smith got frustrated. He thought he had to answer that, and so he did. In the Times and Seasons in May of 1843, he wrote this editorial, and I think this is not, I think he could have handled this problem much better. But he always wanted to think of himself as a linguist and people to believe he was this great translator. So this was how he responded to that charge. He said, "Through the medium of your paper, I wish to correct an error among men that profess to be learned, liberal, and wise. And I do it the more cheerfully because I hope sober thinking and sound reasoning people will soon listen to the voice of truth rather than be led astray by the vain presentations of the self-wise. The error of which I speak is the definition of the word Mormon. It has been stated that this word was derived from the Greek mormo. This is not the case. There was no Greek or Latin upon the plates from which I, through the grace of God, translated the Book of Mormon." So far, I think that's good, right? He's supposed to have translated it from Reformed Egyptian. So I think all he had to do is say his Greek had nothing to do with it. But instead, he goes into this. We say from the Saxon, good, the Dane, God, the Goth, Gada, the German, Gut, the Dutch, Goed, the Latin, Bonus, the Greek, Kalos, the Hebrew, Tob, and the Egyptian, Mon. I'm going to combine all those together, and hence, with the addition of more, or the contradiction more, we have the word Mormon, which literally means more good. So he says the history of the word is actually, it's a conflagration of, you take all of these roots from all of these other languages and you put it with this contraction and you get Mormon, which means more good. To me, that makes no sense at all if you were translating from Reformed Egyptian, which is a language that there's no evidence ever existed. There's no anywhere in the world that you can point to any document that's been found written in Reformed Egyptian. The only Reformed Egyptian document we know of is the golden plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated, and those were conveniently taken back to heaven by Moroni. So we have no instance of any known occurrence of Reformed Egyptian in the world today. And all Smith had to do to answer this was it was Reformed Egyptian. And I just transliterated the letters, and they come out to, Mormon in English. So stop saying it's from Greek. It's not. That would have been a better argument than the convoluted answer he tried to give. But you kind of get a sense of his frustration with some of those arguments and feeling like he needs to respond to some of those arguments that are being made against the Book of Mormon at the time. So things are prospering in Nauvoo. Smith's notoriety is continuing to grow. He's got John Bennett at his side as his right-hand man who is having a ton of influence on him in this time period. He's got a trained army at his hand. He has a city charter that gives him virtual freedom to do what he wants in Nauvoo and run Nauvoo how he sees fit. So the world is looking really good for Joseph Smith in this time period. And it's in that context that he has time to finally sit down, and we see some of the major doctrinal developments in LDS theology that happen in this same time period. He develops his theology regarding heaven, celestial kingdom, the levels of heaven, celestial marriage, baptism for the dead, polygamy. All of those teachings are formulated in this time period in Nauvoo. And so we're going to pick up there next week and look specifically at how the doctrine of the church changed during this few years that they were in Nauvoo. All right? So I hope that was helpful. We will leave off there for today. I realize that was an abrupt halt today, but we will leave off there for today and pick up there next Sunday. Let me pray for us, and I'll answer any questions you might have after that.